Okay, we have audio. I wish we had a lavalier mic, but we don't. So the only mic is there, all right? So I'm going to kind of stand behind this thing, but I may move around because this is, the bottom line is this is a face-to-face class, right? You know, the purpose of conducting this class isn't to get a good audio recording for integrity. It's to relate to you all, right? And sometimes I like to move around. If you remember Newton's inverse square law from your physics, the farther you get away from something, you know, this works for microphones. The loudness of something diminishes geometrically, not linearly. And so, in other words, if you're twice as far away, the microphone will pick it up a fourth as loud, which means that, you know, there's considerable difference if I'm standing here a foot or a foot and a half away from the microphone than there is if I'm walking over there. And you'll find that on the playbacks. You know, you're going to be frustrated if you try to play back these integrity files on the speaker of your little iPad or a little computer speaker. Really, you need headphones or a decent set of computer speakers, you know, because, as I say, some of the audio is going to be low, and I'm not going to be chained to this thing. You know, at Coppin, they give us a wireless mic that we can walk around with, and if I'm across the room, it's going to be, the audio is going to be as good as if I'm, you know, next to it, but that's not the case here. So there's also no video with this stuff. There's not a video camera here, but it doesn't matter. What matters is not whether you have my mug, but whether you have the PowerPoint and the audio commentary. And again, integrity is just a tool. You know, look at it, see if it helps you. You know, it's there. I don't require. The only time I might require something is, like, say, if we were snowed out for a week or something, like the poor people in Boston. You know, then I might be integrating stuff and require that you watch it in lieu of this. But you know, so it's there. Well, the PreSocratic philosophers are people, you know, they're the first philosophers in the Western tradition, and most of the time, it isn't that they didn't do some ethics as well, because they did, but for the most part, they were concerned with theories of reality, you know, with in the area of what we call metaphysics, and with trying to improve upon the popular four-element theory that, you know, reality consisted of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. You know, and so I'm going to kind of go through them. I want to again tell you something that I've already mentioned, that many of these PowerPoints were either based on the original primary text, you know, like I do that, for instance, with Descartes' Meditations, to give you an example, or some other text. These I made up before, you know, I mean, years ago, some of them. This was made up a few years ago from a very detailed text that we used for one semester, and then they went to the text you're now using. And so this is going to have detail in it that is not in your text. I'm going to try to explain, and if you have questions, raise your hand. It is an interactive class. The first three, we call them Milesians because they were from Miletus. And I am never going to ask you dates. And for the pre-Socratics, there's a good reason not to ask dates. What do you see before each one of these dates? C period. What does that mean? Circa, right? And what does circa mean? Yeah, roundabout. Yeah, it's about that one, right? Yeah, in other words, we don't know exactly their dates, But the point is that these people lived and wrote, most of them 100 to 150 years before the pre-Socratics, except when you get to some of the later ones. There's a story that Parmenides actually met with Socrates when Parmenides was an old man and Socrates was a very young man. Socrates, even though he was poor as a philosopher, he did not come from a poor family. He had a good formal education. We know his family had money, I think I mentioned before, because he was a hoplite, a heavily armored soldier of the Peloponnesian War. And you had to, in order to be that kind of a soldier, you had to essentially buy your own armor. I said maybe an analogy would be if you tried to sign up with your local army recruiter and you wanted to be in the cavalry and the tank corps, and they said, well, we think you're the kind of person we're looking for, but did they explain to you that in order to be here, you got to buy your own tank? Now, is that going to be a problem? Well, it would for most people. In other words, you had to have money. So the answer to the trivia question, or the question, if we were in jeopardy, if we said, Thales, and he lived from 625 to approximately 547 BC or BCE, whatever you prefer. The question would be, who was the first Western philosopher? Right? Okay, by common agreement, Thales is. And these people actually were part of a school of philosophy in Miletus. Anaximander was a pupil of Thales, and Anaximander, who we're not going to say very much about, just because the original that I didn't discuss him very much. I should maybe put some more slides, but we're not going to cover all these people, Anaximander was a pupil of Anaximander. Well, we think we can date Thales with some assurance to the early 6th century BC, because among the things he did was accurately predict an eclipse that happened in 585 BC. Now, when we say he accurately predicted an eclipse, some sources I've read say, well, maybe he got within a week or two of it, Did he say it was going to be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday and a given date? Probably not. Probably didn't get that close, but close enough to impress people. And so we consider him the founder of philosophy. Aristotle did, which is a good point to bring up the fact that what survives of a lot of these people And here again, you have to say, well, what would have happened had the library in Alexandria not been burned down? What survives is literal fragments, and what some other philosophers said about them. And the thing is, Aristotle was a student of these pre-Socratic philosophers. So while their works have been lost to history, for the most part, they were around in Aristotle's day, you know. So we have some isolated quotations, and you'll see some in your text, and phrases. But Aristotle considered Thales the first philosopher. They focus on one of the perennial problems of philosophy. Now, for various reasons that I don't want to go off on a tangent explaining, it fell out of fashion in the 1950s on. But in the early part of the 20th century and the late 19th century, one of the ways to approach an introductory course in philosophy, and we get this with a little book Bertrand Russell wrote just after the turn of the century, early 1900s, called The Problems of Philosophy, was to take what was called a problems approach to the subject. Now, later philosophers tried to establish that many of the problems of philosophy were merely pseudo-problems arising from linguistic confusions, and I think that kind of did a death knell to this way of introducing philosophy. But there's more than one way to introduce philosophy, and often, textbooks were written not historically, not topically, but centering around some of the great problems that philosophy has struggled with. One of the earliest was the problem of the one and the many. Is there anything general that exists, or is everything that exists particular? And is reality irreducibly many kinds of things, which the four-element theory would say it is, right? That there are four elements, and that's it. Or is, can we do better and say that ultimately a deep understanding of the nature of reality would show us that there's ultimately one kind of stuff. So the problem of the one and the many is one of the perennial problems of philosophy. There's the problem of universals. There's the problem of free will. You don't have to write these down. Later, after Descartes and his definition of mind, and we'll see this later in the course, there is the mind-body problem. That is, if immaterial substance or mind is so different from matter, how can we account for their causal interaction? And also the problem of other minds. If we think we have private, privileged access to the contents of our own mind, right? But at most, we can only know that other people have minds by external things like their behavior. I think you all have minds, because you tend to act in the same way that I do, given various stimuli. But nonetheless, the problem other minds says, but we're not entirely sure. We can only know for certain that we have mind, So, I can say, well, I know I have a I can only form an analogical argument about your mind. And the rest of you are sitting there saying, hey, well, I know I have a mind, but I'm not so sure about Murawski up there. So the problem of other minds, another one of the perennial problems of philosophy. So one way introductions used to be structured was around the perennial problems that philosophers discussed. But as I say, that approach fell out of fashion with what were called the ordinary language philosophers. At least that's my own take on the subject. Okay. So Thales says something that on the face of it is obviously false. But if you try to put yourself in his shoes, without the sophisticated kinds of, devices we have for analyzing things, if you're looking for an ultimate substance, isn't water a reasonably good candidate? We know that it obviously takes three forms, right? Solid, liquid, and gas. Could there be some other forms that water takes that are not so obvious? And if you think about things like this, ever put a wet log, one that still had some snow on it, either in a fireplace or wood stove, and you look at the smoke coming out, a little hard to tell what is steam and what is smoke. Easy to think, well, maybe wood is just a, complex form of water. And of course, there are some things like what cucumbers are supposed to be 98% water, something like that. So I mean, these. So now Aristotle thought that another reason Thales speculated about water being the ultimate substance is it's necessary for life. And this has played a large part in some of the unmanned space missions, like to Mars. We know that life needs water, so one of the things that indirectly we try to look for in order to say whether or not there might be a possibility of life somewhere is evidence of water, and we have found some on Mars, So water's necessary for the nourishment of life, and Aristotle speculated then that Thales might have given this as a reason why water should be considered the ultimate substance. So no, this does better than the four-element theory. This says, well, we can do better than just saying things are earth, air, fire, and water. Really, there's one ultimate substance. Now, you have Thales getting us in part away from mythology, right, by giving us naturalistic explanations of the composition of things, but not entirely. One of the things he claims is that all things are full of gods. And the way I used to think of this is that he advocated a primitive animism, which, anthropologists will tell you, in many remote locations, that's what the primitive, native peoples believe. In other words, that everything is full of spirits, that inanimate objects like, trees, twigs, and rocks really are inhabited by spirits. And that was the kind of thing I thought he might have advocated. This text tried to speculate that Thales may have gone farther in the direction of what is called naturalism. Naturalism is a view that the natural world is all that exists, the material world. And that if we're looking for explanations of things, we don't have to look outside of the forces of nature. And specifically, we don't have to look toward the agency of external deities, like whether or not Zeus is going to intervene to make it rain. So this text speculated that maybe what he was saying is something closer to naturalism in saying that things have a principle of action, a causal principle within themselves, that we don't look outside them to the gods for an explanation, but they have something within themselves. Well, again, so little of some of what these folks wrote survives that there is a lot of room for possible speculation as to what they might have meant. And you know, unless somebody makes some kind of a grand archaeological discovery, right, and discovers some of these works somehow magically preserved, that are now just coming down to us in isolated fragments. I mean, there still will be room for a lot of speculation here. So this text says then we don't have to look outside of them to explain why they exist and how they work. We don't need to appeal to the agencies of external deities to explain why things in nature work the way that they do. You know, again, that's not everybody's take on this. Well, so we're not going to say a great deal about Thales, but you know, we're trying to give you an idea of the flavor of these early philosophers. Anaximander comes up with a view. Some people think he made a trip to Egypt and Mesopotamia. He comes up with a view that's very much like early Egyptian and Mesopotamian creation myths, that there's a sort of primordial sea of existence out of which everything comes. So I think he may very well have made the trip and become influenced by their views. But he rejects the four-element theory, and so as a pupil of Thales, he actually ends up disagreeing with Thales. Ultimate reality, he said, is not composed of or generated from earth, air, fire, or water. They're so different they couldn't change into one another. Plus, they're paired off as opposites. And also, he thought that if any of them were dominant, then it really would take over. In other words, if water were the ultimate substance, as Thales thought, everything would be obviously water. So if it's not one of the four elements, what is ultimate reality? Well, he uses the word apeiron, the Greek word, which is translated as boundless, indefinite, unperceived. It's a kind of homogeneous mass. Now, this book goes into his view in a pretty detailed way, and so we're going to look at that. But in other words, his view is that ultimate reality is something deeper than the elements that we're in touch with by our senses. So again, he thinks that these elements are so different. fire, the hot, is opposed to earth, the cold, plus the water, the wet, is opposed to air, the dry. I mean, think of it. Yeah, you know, one of the things we have in the men's restroom is one of these air dryers, right? So, you know, you have air evaporating water. Easy to think that they're somehow opposed to one another, right? So if these are paired off, in other words, how is a thing going to turn into its opposite? These early Greeks, and this extends even to Socrates, were just fascinated by opposites in a way that you and I probably are not. So opposites, they knew, tend to cancel each other out, right? Air tends to evaporate water. So how are they going to turn into one another? You know, so, in other words, part of Anaximander's argument that the ultimate substance cannot be one of these. Now, I wouldn't worry a lot about this slide, but it has no beginning, but it is a beginning. And don't worry about Vx and W. Those related to a discussion in the text that we don't need to go off. But your book has a different, as I say, remember, there's a lot of room for speculation here. You know, because some of this, in other words, the texts that have come down leave a lot of room for people to move in and interpret them. And so your book says, well, how did the four elements get separated out of the apeiron, this homogeneous mixture? And your text basically thinks that there was a catastrophic event that you know, that separated them out. I think it even draws an analogy between that and the Big Bang. And so that's one way of interpreting it. I like the more detailed, a little bit more complicated explanation here. In a centrifuge, things get separated out, right? I mean, when I give blood, you know, they take a little sample, put it in a centrifuge, and, you know, I guess separate out the elements so that they can find something out about it. Anyway, and basically this view makes the entire universe to be something like a huge centrifuge where the circular motion of the universe, of course everyone knows that the Earth is the center of the universe and everything revolves around it, or at least that's what these people believe. It's kind of amazing, well, never mind, I won't go off onto that tangent, but it's kind of amazing that some of these other Neolithic sites, I mean, have complicated, you know, drawings of the solar system and all that do not make the Earth the center of everything. But Ptolemaic astronomy, which influenced Western civilization for over 1,000 years, did, and Aristotle's very influenced by this, and so were some of the early pre-Socratics. So the point is, it's like the rudiments of these elements are to be found in this homogeneous, indefinite mixture they appear on. Bertrand Russell calls it like a sea of being with a capital B. a sea of existence out of which everything arises, which, as I say, is very similar to what you find in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian creation myths, where there's a primordial sea of existence, and they explain the beginning of things based on that. And so they have no clear differentiation in the apeiron. But how are they separated out? Well, again, this view makes the entire universe to be something like a huge centrifuge that separates out the various elements by a sort of circular or vortex motion, right? So the vortex motion separates things out and gives us the current schema of things in the universe, where the Earth is at the center of the universe, with progressively lighter things, right? Water next, air next, and fire in a fiery outer layer. And even Aristotle, in his notion of place, basically buys into a view like this. In other words, if I drop this piece of chalk, right, I mean, you and I would tell a story about gravity, right, attracting it to the Earth and pulling it down, and that's why it, falls, right? But in Aristotle's notion of place, why is it that, smoke from the chimney and from a fire goes up, and heavy objects like a rock go down? Well, Aristotle's explanation is that they're seeking their proper place. And the place of a rock is toward the Earth at the center of the universe. The reason the chalk falls is it's seeking its proper place at the center of the universe, toward the Earth. The reason smoke rises from the fire is because it's seeking its proper place toward the fiery outer layer of the heavens. Now, that's a very different explanation than the theory of gravity as to why things are the way they are. But the point is, I mean, Aristotle bought into this kind of a worldview. So we have a fiery outer layer, but you can say, well, I look out at night, I don't see a fiery outer layer. Well, in the old-fashioned planetariums, I am guessing that modern planetariums aren't this way, that they're somehow digital. But when my brother and I were kids, this was before the Science Center was downtown, they had what became and moved to the Science Center a lot of scientific displays on the 5th floor, the top floor of the main branch of the Pratt Library downtown. We used to go down there because we were both fascinated by scientific things, and they had a small planetarium. So, you go in a planetarium, you sit in seats. How is it that you see the stars? Well, there are holes, right, in this circular globe, and there are lights behind it, and we see what seem to be constellations. Well, I mean, this was he had a very similar explanation for what's going on with the stars. That there's an opaque covering over the fiery outer layer, but it's got holes in it, and these holes, are shaped. I mean, the light coming in through the fiery outer layer is what we see from the Earth as the stars. Again, a very different view of the heavens, right? So that was his take on what the stars are. Not right, but... Well, so those are the earliest philosophers. I'm going to kind of move along because really what we just covered is what I hope to get through on Tuesday. And Heraclitus and Parmenides. Well, first of all, let me say this. I mean, Anaximander goes back to one of the four elements. When you see a philosopher make a claim that seems to be very deep and mysterious, like ultimate reality is beyond the reach of the senses, and it is the apeiron, a boundless, indefinite sea of being out of which everything ultimately arose. Well, there are two main ways you can respond to that. This is not my insight. This is Richard Rorty's. He was there when I was at Virginia. One is that, what is the apeiron? You know what? That concept is just too deep for me to wrap my puny little mind around. In other words, one way to respond to what a philosopher says is, wow, they're giving us some kind of a really deep insight into the nature of things. They're making a very deep claim. But the other way of responding to it is that they're making a claim that actually, rather than being deep, is empty. That the reason you can't get your mind around it is that the word might be close to meaningless, and maybe the philosophers who use the term don't even know what they mean. And this has been another way that philosophers have responded to what seem to be deep claims. But we see this even in early Greek philosophy, because Anaximander, as a pupil of Anaximander, just thought this apeiron stuff was a little too mysterious for him to buy into, you know. And so he went back to the big four. Maybe I should have more in there, but basically what he thought was what's needed is a force in nature that explains how it is that all of the other elements can be nothing but forms of one element. Only instead of taking water, he takes air. And the force he uses is condensation and rarefaction. Now, when you think of it, I mean, what's the story you and I were told in high school chemistry, right? When you heat something and you've got steam coming off water, the molecules are becoming thinner, right? Well, basically, his explanation is that all of the elements can be accounted for as various forms of air in varying degrees of, of thickness or condensation. And so fire is the thinnest stuff, and the soul is air itself, and air is air, right? So those are the thinner. They're just very. But then he thinks that if you condense things more, you can get water. And why not? You look at the dew in the morning. Think of it as condensed air, right? You condense it and you can get water, but if you condense it even more, you can get earth or even something as solid as a rock, you know. So basically, he responds to Anaximander's claim that, hey, it can't be one of the four because we don't know how they would turn into each other, by providing a story about how this happens. And this is a good place to pause and say, you know, remind me of something I said at the beginning. What gets these people into your textbooks or into the history of philosophy? Well, not just that they had a view of the world or of the nature of the self or of some moral principle or whatever, but that they defended their claims with arguments, with reasoning, what your book calls logos. You know, we can reject their reasoning, but if you want to deal with their view, you also have to deal with, you know, their view supporting. Now, you could say, well, you know, didn't they experiment around here? There's a good observation made in that video where Sir Kenneth Dover says that what these early philosophers said comes closer to science because it's a naturalistic explanation of how things work, but to an extent it's armchair science. The idea of advancing a theory and then going on to say, well, okay, I mean, that's only half the battle. The real science comes about when you test that theory to see if it, you know, flies, right? That doesn't come along in Western civilization until, you know, more than 1,000 years later with the dawn of the scientific revolution. You know, the idea that it's not enough just to advance a theory, but you need to, you know, subject it to scrutiny and tests to try to confirm or disconfirm it. You know, basically you don't see that in these early scientists and philosophers. It often happens in the history of philosophy that you can have philosophers taking absolutely opposite views of things. And that's what you get with Heraclitus and Parmenides. And they're worth looking at because they influence later philosophers. So they're of interest beyond just, you know, being of historical interest as pre-Socratics. They influence Plato and even influence people like Hegel and Marx in the 19th century. So Heraclitus basically says everything is in constant flux and change, and Parmenides says nothing really changes. Change is an utter illusion. We only think things change. Two opposite views. Plato, when we look at Plato's theory of forms, comes up with an elaborate way of reconciling these seemingly opposite views. So Heraclitus, famous for his claim that you cannot step twice in the same river. Why? Well, you put your toe in on the riverbank, and no matter how quickly you can get it in the second time, the waters will have moved and changed, right? So in a sense, the waters will have changed from the first time you put it in. So you can't step twice in what was exactly the same river. And your book also says, well, you would have changed as well. And this turns out to be Plato's view of this world, that it's in constant flux and motion, that Heraclitus is right. Even rocks. So all things are in flux, and reality then is illustrated by this view of a river. So we talked about this. But his view is a little more complicated than that. He knew, as we do, that there is a sense in which it makes sense to say we swam in the same river. When I was in college age, we used to go tubing down the Gunpowder River. People do that today. Maybe some of you have. It's a nice placid way to spend a nice, afternoon in the late spring or summer. Just float down the gunpowder. If you went and tubing in the gunpowder last summer, and I said, well, hey, I used to go tubing in the same river when I was in college age, you know perfectly well what I'm saying. We do give names to rivers. So he recognizes that there's a sort of underlying principle of oneness where it makes sense to speak of the same river, even if the waters are constantly changing, right? There's no way that the water you're going tubing in was the water that I went tubing in, right? That's long since flowed out to sea or wherever it flowed. So this idea of oneness and difference, and he uses, your book, which I think can be confusing, uses the word logos or logia. And yes, it does mean the study of something. But specifically, he uses the word logos for this principle of oneness underlying things. And for him, a great deal of what we need to be about as philosophers is to understand this principle of oneness and how it affects the things we come into contact with. So throughout the constant change of its waters, the river preserves its identity as the same river. So there is a sense in which you can step in the same river, even if the waters are different. And here again, these are actual examples in this PowerPoint of that he gives. And we look at them and we say, how is it that he thinks these are big insights into the nature of things? But they seem fascinating to him. In other words, that you can have a sort of oneness underlying opposites. See, here we have opposites. So the same pen can draw both a straight and a crooked line, right? Or the same piece of chalk. Two opposite types of lines produced by the same pen. I used to, one of the first teaching jobs, let's get to this first. He talks about seawater having opposite qualities at the same time, right? It's healthy for fish to be in seawater, it can be unhealthy for us. So one thing with opposite properties. No, one of the first teaching jobs I ever had, I taught at a little women's junior college while I was still in grad school. And this was from Charlottesville, Virginia, and I would go over the mountain, what was called Afton Mountain on I-64. Never got tired of that drive. Beautiful drive, because you'd go and you'd see the whole valley if it was a clear day. But I'm going up the mountain. Other people are going down the mountain. The same road can have two opposite properties, as a road that's going up and as a road that's going down. Now, again, we look at this and we say, okay, why do you think that's such an earth-shaking, insight? But to him, it was fascinating that something like a road can have these two opposite properties. Now, what did he think about the ultimate nature of reality? Did he say any more? Well, he also brings in the idea of fire. And remember I said there's room for interpretation. Well, here's a case where scholars disagree. Did he, in the same way that Thales proposed water as the ultimate substance, Anaximander's pupil proposed air, did he propose fire as the ultimate substance? The basic element for him, well, yes, he does mention it's fire, but maybe not. It could have been a metaphor, and here, consider the times when you maybe sat in front of a fireplace and looked at the flames leaping up, right, and they're constantly changing. Well, you can see how fire, again, could be a metaphor for the constantly changing nature of reality. So we could say, well, he can't formulate a technical term that captures exactly what he would like to capture about the nature of things. So the best he can do is use analogies. It's like a flowing river. It's like fire, So that's one story, that he doesn't really propose fire as the ultimate element, but he uses fire as a metaphor, a different metaphor for talking about the constantly changing nature of reality. So you have like those two different stories. Now, this book points out that fire was also looked upon as kind of a divine element. In other words, the gods, you saw in that video, Hephaestus, the armor of the gods, had his forge in a volcano. The volcano is close to the clouds and close to the fiery outer layer, right? The gods of Mount Olympus supposedly live in this fiery outer layer. So you could say fire is not predominant, but it has the priority as a metaphor for the world order's pattern, that the world is eternal and divine in nature, but ever-changing. And Plato thought that the material world was infinite. And that, folks, is a debate that is even carried on down to the present day. some people thought that when there were two stories about the nature of reality, what would happen after the Big Bang. In the 4th of July, you see a firework go up, right, and it explodes, and you see this big flash of light, and then, all the cinders cool off, and you might see streaks of smoke. Well, one version is that that's what's going to happen to the universe, that it's going to constantly expand and cool off, and ultimately everything just goes to a sort of icy state, so to speak. The other view was that the universe would be what was called an oscillating universe. I've been a ham radio operator since I was 14, and I'm not very active in the hobby now, but an oscillator goes back and forth. And an alternative story of the Big Bang makes the universe to essentially be eternal, in a way that the Big Bang looked like it was going to get rid of an eternal universe. The oscillating universe theory says, everything is going to expand, and we're in an expanding phase now. But it's going to reach a point where the mass of things and gravitational attraction, just like one of these paddle balls where you whack the thing and it goes out on a string, but then it comes back, that ultimately everything is going to start going in a different direction and collapse on itself, so you have everything collapsing and then another Big Bang. But observational evidence seems to have shot that view down. Looks like everything's going to burn out. But I think there's another take that puts it. So, what is the material universe something that had a beginning in time, or is it, in some sense, eternal? Well, a lot of the ancient Greeks thought that it was eternal. And you get that kind of a view here in Heraclitus. Now, if you're talking about a tension between opposites, he tries to say that tension is necessary, that this strife between opposite qualities united in the logos is the way everything works. And the world order needs a strife or a tension between opposites. And so things are a unity of diverse elements. This solves the problem of the one and the many. The many are united in the one, the logos. But look at some simple examples. I play guitar. Some of you do too, maybe, or a stringed instrument. Until you get enough tension, like if you're changing guitar strings on that string, you're not going to get a sound out of it, right? There needs the tension of the bridge and the tuning peg pulling in opposite directions, putting tension on that string. And, they didn't have guitars around. They had lyres. And it was the same kind of principle, right? To get a tone out of the lyre, you needed a tension on the strings. So, and to get back to the river example, there were floods in 1993 where the the Mississippi River overflowed its banks, right? I mean, rivers are contained within their banks. What gives the river an identity as the Mississippi River or the Gunpowder River is that it flows within a defined channel. In other words, the waters would like to break out, but the pressure of the bank keeps them in that channel. And so it's this tension between the waters wanting to go one way and the banks keeping it in that gives us a defined thing, namely a river. It gives it its identity as the same river. So a river is in constant tension between the force of its waters and its containing banks, and this is what makes this opposition, is what makes a river a river. No opposition, no river, right? So likewise, if you're going to make a statue, say, out of marble, you have the tension of the marble resisting, the sculptor's chisel, and it's through that tension that you produce something like a statue. So he's got this more complicated view that the world is a constant strife between opposites. And, liberals today call themselves progressives, right? I'll bet you if you interviewed people out on the street, not 2 or 3 out of 100 would understand what is meant by that term. That it's not a linear progression like we get in, say, a progression of science or something that they're talking about. They're talking about a view that Hegel held and that Marx picked up from Hegel, and that basically relates back to Heraclitus, that that progression develops dialectically between one view, an opposite view, and then a synthesis of the two views into a higher level, and then the whole process repeats again, and that's how history develops, both for Marx and Hegel. Only for Hegel it was in mind or ultimate spirit, who he equated with a sort of pantheistic God. Marx dispenses with God and makes it a development in the material world. So if you're talking about progression, you're talking about a strife between opposites that goes on indefinitely, and so that's what I mean. These views influence later philosophers even down to the present day. So Heraclitus quotes Achilles and disagrees with him. You can see how you've got Achilles, the weary warrior, saying, oh man, that war and strife and tension would cease from the earth, tired of fighting battles. And Heraclitus says he doesn't know what he's wishing for. The whole world order needs this constant tension of opposites, and if tension ceased from the earth, so would the earth, so would reality, So he failed. Heraclitus says that Achilles failed to see that in wishing for strife and tension to go away, he was really, in effect, wishing for the destruction of the whole world order that depends on strife and tension. Questions, comments? I know this is kind of, complicated. complicated stuff. You know, it's. I think I did the pre-Socratics for a long time. Then I got away from them, and then because some recent texts I've used put a lot of emphasis on them, I've gone back to it, and I made up this PowerPoint, which is not the way I discussed them in the beginning. But their views can get a little complicated, you know, and you know, it's not the simplest way to you know, to start out an introduction to philosophy, you know. And I mean, some of this stuff, I mean, it's a little tedious to discuss, and I can understand that. But you know, we're trying to understand philosophy at its inception, because it does influence later philosophers. We'll understand Socrates and Plato better if we have a background in the pre-Socratics, you know. So I'm just going to finish up Heraclitus, and we'll pick up. But I'm basically trying to kind of forge ahead and make up some of the lost ground we had because we had an ice day. Who knows what we're going to have Tuesday? Like I say, there's a 70% chance of snow on Tuesday if you listen to the weather, but they don't know how much. It's too early for them to say. We'll just have to see. By the way, I called that phone number at a time when, you know, none of the radio stations had any, and it told you, the recording told you that we're opening at 10, you know. So it's a good number to keep in mind. Yes? Mm-hmm.
So if, let's say we missed Tuesday, would we need to have everything prepared that you would want us to have for Thursday, like both of those readings, or just the Tuesday?
Well, in a perfect world, see, we have the tension here of my wanting to cover everything and stay on time, and the reality of there being only so much time. Right, if we miss a class, you know, I'll try to maybe catch us up a little bit, but you can bet that I'm not going to, with very few exceptions, I'm not going to skip over things, you know. So ideally, you want to at least look at stuff, say, for today, you know, because as you can see, I got into it. We're going to look at Parmenides. Parmenides, his actual argument is a difficult argument, and I simplify it greatly, and so does your text. But look around you. If somebody said, hey, one of these things is true, either everything's changing constantly, or nothing changes and change is just an illusion. Now, what would your senses, I mean, if you had to come down on the side of who you think is closer to being right there, what would your senses tell you? Yeah, everything's changing, right? Basically, Parmenides does not rely on observations to establish his claim that ultimate reality is eternal and the same and changeless. He relies on an abstract argument to make the point. And basically, he says the same thing that Groucho Marx says. Hey, here's my argument. Now, what are you going to believe? Me or your own lying eyes? You know, your eyes tell you everything's changing and that this guy Heraclitus is right. But I got an argument that tells you that your eyes deceive you, changes and illusion. You know. So we're going to look at that. He's the first person, at least Bertrand Russell in his History of Philosophy, observes that he's probably the first Western philosopher to use an abstract, totally abstract, what we call an a priori argument. We'll get into that next time. But look at the slides if you have a chance. Again, this is recorded, for your edification. If you came in and did not sign the roll, please do so on the way out. And hopefully we'll see you Tuesday. Let's see what happens. See what nature does between now and then. But thanks for coming out.